Hello again, listeners to Community Radio Northern Beaches, 88.7, 90.3 FM, streaming live on our website, www.rnb.org.au. We're also podcasting for Pause and Irritations, our online public policy journal. And I'm Michael Lester. Topic for today is the disturbing topic of terror and terrorism. And our guest argues that we still in the West and in Australia are at war with terror and on terror, and that we're still fighting the 9/11 war on terror. What we might talk about is where this political movement and rhetoric has come from and what it means and where it's taking us currently. So I'm delighted to welcome again to our program here Dr. Alison Broinowski, who has a Medal of the Order of Australia for her previous work as a senior public servant and former diplomat. These days she's an academic, a journalist and a public commentator. And she's also a member of the committee and a former president of the Australians for War Powers Reform. Thanks very much for joining us again, Alison.
It's a pleasure, Michael.
We're still fighting a war on terror. What's prompting you to say that, even in terms of what's going on today in the news?
Well, as many of your listeners will have done, I woke up this morning to the appalling news that was just breaking on ABC out of Lebanon, where it is reported that the Israeli Defense Forces, so-called, the Israeli military, have caused pagers, that is, communication pagers, in people's pockets to explode. More than 1,000 people are seriously injured. 11 is the latest count on how many are dead. But the burns and the injuries, as reported, are just horrendous. And as far as I'm concerned, if this isn't an act of terrorism, I defy anyone to tell me what it is.
In some of your recent analysis and writing, you're writing under a heading worse than terror. And I think you're trying to point to the ways in which militarism and the violence associated with it is doing perhaps more damage even to the world and its security than terror.
Well, that's right. And what I argue in this so far absolutely unpublishable book, because it makes some people very defensive, what I argue there is that, in fact, militarism and states that use militarism as a form of coercion on others and as a way of aggrandizing their own power and getting their own way are actually committing acts of state terror themselves. And there's no difference, except in size, between them and, for instance, a small gang of Muslim terrorists, so-called, in, say, Syria or wherever, except that the whole scale of the thing is so much greater. Now, what we are seeing is, ever since 2001, and indeed before, I mean, history of terror has a very long history of centuries, but particularly since 2001, we've been led to believe that terrorism is Muslim or Islamist, and that terrorism is perpetrated by various organizations incorporating those sorts of people. And very few of us have stopped and asked questions about what that means. We have also, in the last few years, in these 2 decades, got ourselves sort of hypnotized into accepting that any group that is said to be a terrorist group is suspect, and that we ought to declare them as terrorists and list them, as many countries do. And then that has serious implications, both for us and for them, which most of the time many of us haven't thought about. I mean, it is the case that Australia has 34 organizations listed as terrorist. Now, that means that any of their citizens, any of those organizations' members, can have a hard time entering Australia or living peacefully in Australia or doing whatever else they want to do. And whatever the reason is for them belonging to such an organization is not something that most of us even think about. Hezbollah and Hamas are always referred to in our media as the terrorist groups. Terrorist always goes with that word. And yet, Hamas is the elected authority in the Palestinian territory, in Gaza. And They don't have any other government. Hamas is their government. So we have accepted that the government of Gaza is a terrorist organization. And we're told so again and again, particularly by people in Israel, of course. And one of the most interesting things about this list of terrorist organizations to which Australia subscribes is that our newly appointed envoy on anti-Semitism is reported today to be urging the Australian government, and will do so in a submission that's being heard next week, I think, that we should declare Hizb ut-Tahrir a terrorist organization. Now, so far, Australia hasn't done that. Other countries have. The United States, of course, has. New Zealand has. Canada has. Britain has. They have more than our 34 on their list of terrorist organizations. But so far, Australia, and that means ASIO plus the Australian Federal Police, have not seen any good reason to declare Hizb ut-Tahrir a terrorist organization. If they did, it would mean that any Australian who was a member of it or was in some way supporting it would find themselves in a very difficult situation, having not necessarily done anything. So we need to think more carefully about who we designate and why we designate them, I think.
Of course, the definition and the whole concept of terrorism is conceptually very difficult and morally very difficult. But the fact of the matter is that in political rhetoric, certainly terrorism has become probably the most prominent security issue of our day, certainly since the start of the millennium. But as you say, terrorism's been around, for centuries almost, but certainly even in the late 20th century, we had the anarchists and bombings early in the 20th century too. We've seen lots of terrorist activity, yet there's never been an ability of the international community, including under the UN, to come up with a conceptually clear definition, has there, that would both define and criminalize and penalize terrorism. But this has not been for want of trying. There is no international agreement or treaty, is there?
No, there's not. And for the perfectly good reason that when the world's nations gather in the UN General Assembly, one man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter, right? And so the people who want to designate some organizations as terrorists are vehemently opposed by the nations that support those. And so there has never been a proper definition, which leaves it to individual countries or groups of countries to decide for themselves and nominate these groups. Now, as I said earlier, we haven't given an awful lot of concern to that, but it is becoming quite a serious matter. And it means that Australia would find itself, and indeed is already, involved in fighting, for instance, the Houthi in Yemen, because we have accepted that they are a terrorist organization, whereas, in fact, there is no proper government functioning in Yemen, and Houthi are just about as close as they get to it. And the Houthi have recently fired a long-range missile into Israel. So the risk of a war developing there, in which Australia would find itself on the Israeli side against a group that we call terrorists, is really serious. And people ought to understand this, because apart from any other reason about the nature of the war, and who our allies and coalition partners in that would be, Britain and the United States, of course, maybe France. The important thing is that we find ourselves, because of what we've done in declaring this group terrorist organization, exposed to supporting Israel, which has been condemned by two international courts as potentially committing genocide and apartheid in the territory of Gaza, and indeed in the Palestinian territories on the West Bank. And so we would find ourselves in support of a country that is in defiance of international law. Does Australia want to do that? We go on all the time about our respect for the international so-called rules-based order. I would like us to talk more about the international law-based order. We might begin to understand our position better then.
Yeah, our guest here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches is Dr. Alison Broinowski, and we're talking about her views and writings of the situation that we're still very much at war in the West, on the war on terror, still fighting the 9/11 war. So notwithstanding, as we've said, decades of completely unsuccessful attempts to be clear in the international community about what constitutes terrorism, what we had, of course, particularly after the 9/11 attack in 2001, that many individual nation states went ahead and enacted their own legislation, creating a whole range of terrorism offences, including Australia. And these national laws are very, very diverse, aren't they?
They are, and Australia enacted more of them than any other country, some 90 odd. Some other countries which rushed to legislate against terrorism have since retracted those laws, and they're no longer in operation. But Australia has not done. We still have a very large number of anti-terrorism laws which can intrude into people's lives in all sorts of ways that are not all that often reported, but perhaps the reason for that is they don't want them reported. And there are, I mean, your premises can be broken into and your technology taken away and crashed if they decide it's necessary. Things like that can happen. And if you ask anything about what's called a special intelligence operation, that in itself can be an offence under our terrorism laws. And if a journalist reports that such a thing has happened, that person can be exposed to jail term for having done so. So you see why we don't hear an awful lot about it, and why a lot of our mainstream media, not including your good self, are running scared of this sort of legislation. And, you know, we're all sitting here looking at a nice sunny day, thinking how pleasant life is. And it is actually rather dangerous, I suggest.
In that regard, of course, international statistics on terrorism and its impact globally have been showing steady falling and or steadying of the rates of terrorism by various measures. And as far as Australia is concerned, with its extensive legislation, as you say, and regulation, I believe that on the Global Terrorism Index, which is produced each year, covering just about the whole population of the world, in terms of impact of terrorism, Australia rates 57th. In other words, we're rated as having a very low impact on our country of terrorism. The US is rated 30. Most of the countries that are rated as having a big impact from terrorism and deaths and fatalities and kidnapping are obviously poor and developing countries, aren't they?
They are. And, you know, I was talking earlier about we all tend to think of terrorism as being by definition Islamist. In fact, it's countries with majority Muslim populations where the majority of those sorts of incidents and fatalities and so on that you mentioned occur largely because there are groups fighting each other, like in a sort of an ongoing tit-for-tat revenge campaign, either because of religion or because of their desire for power or whatever it may be. And a lot of that stuff doesn't reach us or bother us. It probably bothers a lot of Muslim Australians who have families and relatives still in those countries. But that is fact. And while terrorism was one of the prime causes of anxiety and fear assessed by the annual ANU survey until about 5 or 6 years ago, it isn't anymore. And in fact, what my book argues is that seeing this drop off in anxiety about terror, some of our conscientious governments are anxious to make us not forget. We are reminded every year by the head of ASIO how very likely it is that we could be attacked in some nasty way, and how we are surrounded by all sorts of people from whom, of course, ASIO keeps us safe all the time. But this sort of stuff bothers people whose responsibility is, let's be charitable, to keep us safe. And when that level of anxiety in the community drops off, some of them worry. Others do something else, and I'll describe it. What they do, and this is particularly in relation to large groups, influential people in the United States, have for several decades now been contemplating how catastrophic catalyzing event, unquote, a catalyzing catastrophic event would be used to rev up fear and make people understand that massive military expenditure, massive aggressive wars are necessary for their self-preservation. Now, that began in the early 1990s, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, when a group in America called PNAC, the Project for the New American Century, got together and worked out how that sort of thing could be done. They even considered using biological weapons on other countries to cause panic, to cause fear, to make people say, oh gosh, we need to be defended. Let's argue against the huge expansion of military capacity. Now, since that time, there have been subsequent. PNAC collapsed. There's been another one called CNAC, and sorry, I haven't got that acronym quite right, but it starts with C. And those people are working along similar, slightly more modern lines. And this year, as well as every year that when there's a presidential campaign in the United States ever since 1986, the Heritage Foundation, an ultra-conservative operation where the late Owen Harries used to work, brought out a program for America, a mandate, they call it, for the new president to execute. And that would curl your hair to look at if, in fact, Trump, who denies that he has anything to do with it, but he's mentioned in it 300 times, if Trump got elected, the kinds of things that he would be involved in doing if he followed the recommendations would be sacking every civil servant in the United States who didn't sign up to agreeing with Trump on everything. I mean, this is not terrorism, but you see the connection between these things. If you make people scared enough of whatever, they will agree to these things. And so here we have now 2 attempted assassination attempts on the president. And while we know that that is no exception in US history, and there have been successful ones as well as lots of unsuccessful ones, that is the kind of thing which makes some suspicious minds wonder if that is the catastrophic catalyzing event that some people would like to see happen in order to panic people into voting the way they want.
Coming back to the situation in Australia here, as you've mentioned, we've got quite stringent legislation, and we've noted that national approaches to anti-terrorist acts and definition and declaring of terrorist organisations is very varied. What is the actual situation in Australia? We presumably have a piece of legislation that has an open democratic process before these things happen. How transparent are these processes in terms of what they're delivering, and what sort of changes have we seen, if any, over time, the 20-odd years since we brought in our legislation in the number and type of organisations that are being declared under this legislation as terrorist organisations?
Well, I don't think that there's been very much due process at all. In fact, after 2001, as you say, we brought in a raft of anti-terrorist legislation, all of which was passed sort of on the nod, more or less, which was exactly, you might think, exactly the intention of the people who cooked up the war on terror. By the way, it was the only stroke of genius that I know that George W. Bush performed. It was brilliant. The war on terror. He got it. It meant that he and his successors could do anything, and nobody would ever know if the war had been won, if it was over, who it was against, or anything about it. And that's why it's called the Forever War. We're still fighting it. And we signed up for it under John Howard in 2001 without any legislative process at all. He just discussed it with Alexander Downer on the phone, from his plane and came back and announced that we were at war with terror. Why? Because we're a member of the AUKUS alliance. AUKUS has nothing to do with the Middle East, has nothing to do with terrorism. And Australia doesn't have to follow that kind of procedure under AUKUS anyway. And so there was no discussion, and all that legislation, there was no public discussion, and all that legislation against terror in Australia went through very quickly and very easily. And as I said, none of it's been rescinded or revoked. And as far as our definition of terrorism is concerned, I can't tell you, as a matter of fact, thank you for raising it, I can't tell you who devised it. I must find out. But ours is very simple. Other countries have much more complicated ones, and there are whole philosophical books about this, where people go into enormous detail about what it is. You can see why there is no international agreement. But the significant thing for us is that we, and the head of ASIO has repeated this recently in his definition of different kinds of terrorism, it's about the motive being religious or political, and it's about groups or individuals making those sorts of attacks for those violent attacks for those motives. Now, that doesn't include the concept that I find very interesting, which is terrorism as done by states. In other words, violent operations, just like a group would do or an individual might do. But those sorts of attacks made by states, not as part of a war, but in order to terrorize the enemy, whoever that may be. And that is what I was referring to at the very beginning this morning when I mentioned this awful event that has just happened in Lebanon at the hands of the Israeli Defense Force, we are led to believe. And Israel hasn't admitted that yet.
As you've said, Bush's move to declare a war on terror was most innovative from many points of view because, of course, wars are normally declared on another state by a state if they are declared. And this was a war declared not on a state, but on presumably a group of terrorists, however defined. It was a very interesting move politically and rhetorically. But I wanted to ask the question, I guess, underlying this, what is the essential difference between an act of war and an act of terrorism?
In the olden days, wars were declared and ended as well. Ever since, well, I suppose you can't really say Korea, but ever since Vietnam, that has not been the case. We have had undeclared wars ever since then, and Australia has gone to them. We have never been told that the war on terror has ended, and that the reason for that is financial. Because in the United States, in order to secure congressional funding for a war, they have to get an authorization for commitment of funds to it from the Congress. And they got that readily for the war on terror. And they have gone on extending it every few years ever since. And that means, and not only that, but the Congress has devoted more money to it all the time. And that means that any successive president is still war on terror, and including whoever is going to win the next election. And it's not a very comforting thought when you realize that that entitles a US president to attack anyone they decide deserves it, and to demand that countries like their allies elsewhere, here, Britain, so on, join them in it. And one thing that I would be very comforted by would be if an Australian government went quietly to Washington and said, look, to anyone who is the new president, look, we are not interested in fighting a losing war against China. And if you find some terrorist act to justify that, we will not be interested in the details because we've seen false flags before, and we don't want to see another one which implicates us in a war which we would lose and the consequences of which would be much greater for Australia than for the United States.
Well, as we wrap up here on Radio Northern Beaches Community Voices with our guest, Dr. Alison Broinowski, who, among other things, is a member of the committee and former president of Australians for War Powers Reform. Alison, there's a strong relationship between situations of conflict and terrorism. In other words, they seem to go hand in hand. Most of the conflict around the world is in developing countries, and there's lots of terrorism. And if you look at the global ranking of countries impacted by terrorism, just about all of them and the most impacted are developing countries, where you're getting political conflicts and insurgencies and what have you. But does the labeling of terrorism by one side or the other have a tendency to not only silence dissent and critics of whatever violence is being undertaken, but stifling even the very negotiations that are needed and compromises towards a peace?
I think that's exactly right. And that's one of the things that is most disquieting about the situation we're in. You know, you stick this label, terrorist, on country or a group or a leader, and that then constitutes justification for doing whatever you want to them. I mean, the head of Iranian military was just knocked off by an American attack, just like that, under Trump, and he boasted of it. That's because they say that the regime in Iran is a terrorist one. Now, they can call whoever they like terrorist, and this is what is so dangerous about it. And there won't be an agreed definition for the reasons that we were talking about before. And so therefore, I think that Australian leaders would be wise to stand back and take a deep breath very carefully before they designate any more. In particular, Hizb ut-Tahrir, which has a bad reputation, but then every terrorist organization is demonized in the media. As soon as they're called terrorist, everyone goes, ah. And as you suggested, we then don't question anymore who they are, what they believe in, what their issue is, or why it is that they risk their lives, many of them, in order to achieve some religious or political end. Well, on the religious side, by the way, one of the motivations that appears all the time for Muslim terrorism is the obligation to extract revenge from someone who has attacked you. Now, that might be Osama bin Laden attacking the United States, or it might be some local group in any Muslim country attacking the other for various hurts imposed upon them. So we need to be very careful about that too. Because when you get to be talking to people about religion, it's about their absolute inner identity that they hold very dear. And no amount of logical discussion is going to change that. And so that is one more reason I suggest why Australia should be very careful in designating any more organizations as terrorist, particularly if we find ourselves fighting on the side of a country which is itself perpetrating terrorist acts.
Well, look, thank you very much, Alison Broinowski, for joining us here on Community Voices Radio Northern Beaches to talk about the concept of terrorism in our current world. I mean, this is obviously mired in all sorts of complexities, moral, legal, political, and even trying to make sense of what terrorism is, in particular, how the concept of violence by anyone can become understood as terrorism is, I think, a really difficult question to grapple with, but thank you for sharing with us your insights into these issues.
That's a pleasure, Michael.